Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neo-Fusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of Neo-Fusionism. Neo-Fusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books, published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. For today's episode, we will be reading Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell. And this book is way up there on the list, probably in the top 5, I would say, most important books you can read. This is really important, and so I've picked a lot of different sections out of here that I want to mention, and I think that we're going to be looking at some of the future books through a lens of having read this one, through a lens of the different visions that he explains inside of this. I think this book also ties in with the books that we've been looking at most recently. When we read The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker, he sort of laid out two different ways of viewing human behavior, the blank slate theory and the human nature theory, the non-blank slate, I suppose you could call it, the theory of human nature. And then last episode we looked at pragmatism, and I mentioned William James' conception of the tender-minded and the tough-minded, and is that related to sort of a idealist or rationalist versus the empiricist, tough-minded empiricist. And I think that as we look at this dichotomy presented in this book, A Conflict of Visions, we'll find that it fits into this framework of these multiple ways of looking at human nature. And I think actually that you could probably, well, I'll get into that more a little bit later. I think I'm going to go right in here and start reading from the first section here. I've got a bunch of sections I want to read to you, so I'm going to get started. He really explains this well. He quotes from Adam Smith in this section. He uses Adam Smith as one of his supporters of one of his visions. And so he talks about Adam Smith quite a bit in his vision and explains from there. He says, outer quote, he says, "The capacities and limitations of man are implicitly seen in radically different terms by those whose explicit philosophical, political, or social theories are built on different visions. Man's moral and mental natures are seen so differently that their respective concepts of knowledge and of institutions necessarily differ as well. Social causation itself is conceived differently, both as to mechanics and results. Time and its ancillary phenomena, traditions, contracts, economic speculation, for example, are also viewed quite differently in theories based on different visions. The abstractions which are part of all theories tend to be viewed as more real by followers of some visions than by followers of opposing visions. Finally, those who believe in some visions view themselves in a very different moral role from the way the followers of other visions view themselves. The ramifications of these conflicting visions extend into economical, judicial, military, philosophical, and political decisions. Rather than attempt the impossible task of following all these ramifications in each of the myriad of social visions, the discussion here will group these visions into two broad categories: the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. These will be abstractions of convenience, recognizing that there are degrees in both visions, that a continuum has been dichotomized, that in the real world there are often elements of each inconsistently grafted onto the other, and innumerable combinations and permutations. With all these caveats, it is now possible to turn to an outline of the two visions, and specifics on the nature of man, the nature of knowledge, and the nature of social processes, as seen in the constrained and unconstrained visions. The nature of man, the constrained vision. Adam Smith provided a picture of man which may help make concrete the nature of a constrained vision. Writing as a philosopher in 1759, Nearly 20 years before he became famous as an economist, Smith said in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, quote, "Let us suppose that the great empire of China, with all its myriads of inhabitants, was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake. And let us consider how a man of humanity in Europe, who had no sort of connection with that part of the world, would react upon receiving intelligence of this dreadful calamity. He would, I imagine, first of all express very strongly his sorrow for the misfortune of that unhappy people. He would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life, and the vanity of all the labors of man, which could thus be annihilated in a moment. He would too, perhaps, if he was a man of speculation, enter into many reasonings concerning the effects which this disaster might produce upon the commerce of Europe, and the trade and business of the world in general. And when all this fine philosophy was over, when all these human sentiments had been once fairly expressed, he would pursue his business or his pleasure, take his repose or his diversion, with the same ease and tranquillity as if no such accident had happened. The most frivolous disaster which could befall himself would occasion a much more real disturbance. If he was to lose his little finger tomorrow, he would not sleep tonight, but provided he never saw them, he would snore with the most profound security over the ruin of 100 million of his brethren." End quote. The moral limitations of man in general, and his egocentricity in particular, were neither lamented by Smith nor regarded as things to be changed. They were treated as inherent facts of life, the basic constraint in his vision. The fundamental moral and social challenge was to make the best of the possibilities which existed within that constraint, rather than dissipate energies in an attempt to change human nature, an attempt that Smith treated as both vain and pointless. For example, if it were somehow possible to make the European feel poignantly the full pain of those who suffered in China, the state of mind would be perfectly useless, according to Smith, except to make himself miserable, without being of any benefit to the Chinese. Smith said, "Nature, it seems, when she loaded us with our own sorrows, thought that they were enough, and therefore did not command us to take any further share in those of others than what was necessary to prompt us to relieve them." Instead of regarding man's nature as something that could or should be changed, Smith attempted to determine how the moral and social benefits desired could be produced in the most efficient way within that constraint. Clearly, a society cannot function humanely, if at all, when each person acts as if his little finger is more important than the lives of 100 million other human beings. But the crucial word here is act. We cannot prefer ourselves so shamelessly and blindly to others when we act, Smith said, even if that is the spontaneous or natural inclination of our feelings. In practice, people on many occasions sacrifice their own interests to the greater interests of others, according to Smith, but this was due to such intervening factors as devotion to moral principles, to concepts of honor and nobility, rather than to loving one's neighbor as oneself. Through such artificial devices, man could be persuaded to do for his own self-image or inner needs what he would not do for the good of his fellow man. In short, such concepts were seen by Smith as the most efficient way to get the moral job done at the lowest psychic cost. Despite the fact that this was a moral question, Smith's answer was essentially economic, a system of moral incentives, a set of trade-offs, rather than a real solution by changing man. One of the hallmarks of the constrained vision is that it deals in trade-offs rather than solutions. In his classic work, The Wealth of Nations, Smith went further. Economic benefits to society were largely unintended by individuals, but emerged systemically from the interactions of the marketplace, under the pressures of competition and the incentives of individual gain. Moral sentiments were necessary only for shaping the general framework of laws within which this systemic process could go on. This was yet another way in which man, with all the limitations conceived by Smith, could be induced to produce benefits for others, for reasons ultimately reducible to self-interest. It was not an atomistic theory that individual self-interests added up to the interest of society. On the contrary, the functioning of the economy and society required each individual to do things for other people. It was simply the motivation behind these acts, whether moral or economic, which was ultimately self-centered. In both his moral and his economic analysis, Smith relied on incentives rather than dispositions to get the job done. End outer quote. All right, we saw from that section the same sort of thing that we saw back with Steven Pinker in The Blank Slate and Human Nature. Adam Smith is laying out the notion that there is, in fact, a human nature, and that it is self-centered, and that trying to change the self-centered nature of humans is pointless. And so that the things that we do are going to have to operate within that constraint in order to use incentives and trade-offs to get the things, the sort of social behavior that we're looking for. And so that's kind of the fundamental here of the constrained and unconstrained vision, is that the constrained vision believes that, whereas the unconstrained vision believes that there are no limits as to what humanity can accomplish, and therefore some people are simply able to see into a more perfect moral realm and guide the way to for the rest of humanity to that place. It's kind of the unconstrained vision. So let's move on a little bit to the next section. He begins to talk about some of the ways these constrained and unconstrained visions affect the way we see other parts of life. And he starts with an important section, which is how we understand knowledge and reason. In particular, knowledge. He says about which he says the following. Outer quote. In the constrained vision, any individual's own knowledge alone is grossly inadequate for social decision-making, and often even for his own personal decisions. A complex society and its progress are therefore possible only because of numerous social arrangements, which transmit and coordinate knowledge from a tremendous range of contemporaries, as well as from the even more vast numbers of those from generations past. Knowledge, as conceived in the constrained vision, is predominantly experience, transmitted socially in largely inarticulate forms, from prices, which indicate costs, scarcities, and preferences, to traditions which evolve from the day-to-day experiences of millions in each generation, winnowing out in Darwinian competition what works from what does not work. Friedrich A. Hayek expressed this view when he said, quote, "The growth of knowledge and the growth of civilization are the same only if we interpret knowledge to include all the human adaptations to environment which past experience has been incorporated. Not all knowledge in this sense is part of our intellect, nor is our intellect the whole of our knowledge. Our habits and skills, our emotional attitudes, our tools, and our institutions, all are in this sense adaptations to past experience, which have grown up by the selective elimination of less suitable conduct. They are as much an indispensable foundation of successful action as is our conscious knowledge." End quote. In this vision, it is not simply that individuals rationally choose what works from what does not work, but also, and more fundamentally, that the competition of institutions and whole societies leads to a general survival of more effective collections of cultural traits, even if neither the winners nor the losers rationally understand what was better or worse about one set or the other. Values which may be effective at the tribal level will tend to be overwhelmed by values that permit or promote the functioning of larger aggregations of people. From this perspective, man has certainly more often learnt to do the right thing without comprehending why it was the right thing, and he still is better served by custom than understanding. There is thus more intelligence incorporated in the system of rules of conduct than in man's thoughts about his surroundings. Knowledge is thus the social experience of the many, as embodied in behavior, sentiments, and habits, rather than the specifically articulated reason of the few, however talented or gifted those few might be. End outer quote. So that's a great explanation of knowledge, and how knowledge is incorporated in all of our surroundings and all of our traditions and our languages and everything else, the knowledge of the past has shaped our social institutions bit by bit in this kind of evolutionary process, which I think is really interesting. He says, quote, "The distribution of knowledge in society varies greatly according to the definition of knowledge. Where knowledge is defined in the constrained vision to include vast amounts of unarticulated but vitally important information and conclusions summarized in habits, aversions, and attractions, as well as in words and numbers, then it is far more broadly spread through a society than when its definition, as in the unconstrained vision, is restricted to the more sophisticatedly articulated facts and relationships. The constrained vision, which sees severe limits on man's conscious rationality, relies heavily on evolved systemic processes to convey and coordinate the broad array of knowledge necessary for human survival and progress. The unconstrained vision, which sees greater prospects for human mastery of knowledge, sees in those with special intellectual skills both the proof of its assumption and the vehicles of knowledge and reason for promoting social improvement. Articulation plays an important role in the dissemination of knowledge, as knowledge is conceived in the unconstrained vision. Discussion is the path that leads to discovery and demonstration, according to Godwin, who, as noted earlier, also considered accuracy of language to be the indisputable prerequisite of sound knowledge. But articulation plays no such crucial role in the constrained vision. It has been the misfortune, not as these gentlemen think it the glory, of this age that everything is to be discussed, Burke declared. He had no use for pert loquacity, and argued that even reason, by frequent repetition, loses its force. Hamilton was suspicious of skilled articulation, which could be mere painting and exaggeration or artificial reasoning to vary the nature and obvious sense of words, and noted that it is extremely easy on either side to say a great number of plausible things. Hobbes declared that words are wise men's counters, but they are the money of fools. Unarticulated social experience has remained a more effective guide to behavior than articulated rationality in the tradition of the constrained vision. According to Hayek, it is enough that people know how to act in accordance with the rules without knowing that the rules are such and such in articulated terms. Articulate youth, idealistic and trained in the latest and most advanced forms of knowledge, as knowledge is conceived in the unconstrained vision, are a great hope to the future to those with that vision. So are intellectuals. Neither is viewed in this way in the constrained vision, where knowledge is more expansively defined and consequently more widely distributed, as in the constrained vision, intellectuals have no commanding advantage over the common man." End quote. Yeah, that kind of disassembles the notion of elitism, because human nature constrains us to the point where we've got limited flexibility in how we're going to be as people. You know, like we all have certain constraints upon us. He talks more about the order and structure of social organizations. He says, quote, "A pattern of regularities may reflect either an intentional design or the evolution of circumstances not planned by any of the agents or forces involved in its emergence. Trees or vegetations of different kinds may grow wild at different heights on a mountainside, or a garden may be laid out with great care and forethought by a gardener. Both visions acknowledge the existence of both kinds of social processes, but they differ on the extent, efficiency, and desirability of evolved orders and planned designs. The constrained vision puts little faith in deliberately designed social processes, since it has little faith that any manageable set of decision-makers could effectively cope with the enormous complexities of designing a whole blueprint for an economic system, a legal system, or a system of morality or politics. The constrained vision relies instead on historically evolved social processes and evaluates them in terms of their systemic characteristics, their incentives and modes of interaction, rather than their goals or intentions. Language is perhaps the purest example of an evolved social process, a systemic order without a deliberate overall design, Rules of language are indeed written down, but after the fact, codifying existing practices, and most people have begun obeying these rules in early childhood before being explicitly taught them. Yet languages are extremely complex and subtle, and of course vital to the functioning of a society. Even for small children, language is not so much a matter of parroting what has been explicitly articulated, but rather of inferring complex rules never fully explained. Language is thus the epitome of an evolved, complex order, with its own systemic characteristics, inner logic, and external social consequences, but without having been deliberately designed by any individual or council. Its rationality is systemic, not individual, an evolved pattern rather than an excogitated blueprint. Language is, in effect, a model for social processes in legal, economic, political, and other systems, as viewed within the constrained vision. It is not that languages cannot be created, Esperanto clearly was, but that they are more effective when evolved because natural languages draw upon a vast more wealth of experiences over the centuries than will be at the command of any individual or council designing a language. Evolved language also serves a greater municipality of purposes than any given individual or council may be able to enumerate, much less weigh. In much the same way, the complex characteristics of an economic system may be analyzed in skeletal outline after the fact, but the flesh and blood reality has often evolved on its own, and it is considered more efficient when markets have evolved than when planned by central authorities. Deliberate action or planning at the individual level is by no means precluded by the constrained vision, just as individuals choose their own words and writing style within the scope and rules of language. What is rejected in both cases by the constrained vision is individual or intentional planning of the whole system. Man, as conceived in the constrained vision, simply is not capable of such a feat, though he is capable of the hubris of attempting it. Systemic rationality is considered superior to individual or intentional rationality. The constrained vision is not a static vision of the social process, nor a view that the status quo should not be altered. On the contrary, its central principle is evolution. Language does not remain unchanged, but neither is it replaced according to a new master plan. A given language may evolve over the centuries to something almost wholly different, but as a result of incremental changes, successively validated by the usage of the many rather than the planning of the few. In politics as well, evolution is the keynote of the constrained vision. Burke declared, "A state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation." Yet he would not subject whole political systems to the mercy of untried speculations. Individual brilliance was no substitute for pragmatic adjustments, even by people of less brilliance. Quote, "I have never yet seen any plan which has not been mended by the observations of those who were much inferior in understanding to the person who took the lead in the business. By a slow but well-sustained progress, the effect of each step is watched. The good or ill success of the first gives light to us in the second, and so, from light to light, we are conducted safely through the whole series." End quote. The same basic view has been expressed in the 20th century by F.A. Hayek. Quote, "Tradition is not something constant, but the product of a process of selection, guided not by reason, but by success." End quote. The Hayekian view is even further removed from deliberate design than that of Burke, since Hayek incorporates a survival of the fittest culture selection process, which depends upon survival in competition with other social systems, rather than simply on the basis of pragmatic individual judgments of success. The intervening influence of Darwin between these two exponents of the constrained vision is apparent. It is not, however, a theory of the survival of the fittest individuals, but of the fittest social processes. End outer quote. So yeah, that's pretty thorough discussion of how change is a necessary component. It's not just a set of understandings and about human nature and behaviors and social patterns created to fit those things set in stone for all time, because they exist as a result of slow modifications, just like biological processes. So moving right along. He says, quote, "In the constrained vision, society is often analogized to a living organism which cannot be comprehensively disassembled and reconstructed in a different way without fatal results. Burke, for example, wrote of hacking a body into pieces and then throwing the pieces into the kettle of magicians in hope of regeneration. In the constrained vision, the concept of nation building is a fundamental misconception. Nations may grow and evolve, but cannot be built. The intertemporal commitment of loyalty, seen as an abandonment of impartiality in future behavior by those with the unconstrained vision, was viewed very differently by those with the constrained vision. If one's view of human nature is very constrained, then the alternative to loyalty is not impartiality, but pure selfishness. The kinds of emotional attachments which lead to loyalty are thus seen as beneficial social ties, essential to the functioning of the whole society. According to Burke, quote, to be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society, is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affections. It is the first link in the series by which we proceed towards a love of our country and to mankind, end quote. In a similar vein, Hamilton said, quote, we love our families more than our neighbors. We love our neighbors more than our countrymen in general. End outer quote. So these are just a few good spots where he talks about things like loyalty and that fantastic Burke quote, and how loyalty is a function of human nature in order to a social process, a traditional social process, in order to mitigate pure unadulterated selfishness. On the topic of equality, he goes on to say, quote, the crucial difference between the constrained and the unconstrained visions of man is not in their perceptions of people as they are. What fundamentally distinguishes the two visions is their respective perceptions of human potential. The average person, as he exists today, is not seen in more optimistic terms by those with the unconstrained vision. On the contrary, some of the most sweeping dismissals of the current capabilities of ordinary people have come from those with the unconstrained vision, from Godwin in the 18th century to George Bernard Shaw in the 20th, even as they urged sweeping economic equalization. Indeed, one of the arguments for sweeping equalization of material conditions is that it will enable the masses to improve themselves in addition to enjoying life more fully. In short, the gap between the actual and the potential is greater in the unconstrained vision than in the constrained vision. So too is the gap between the existing masses of people and those who have advanced further toward the intellectual and moral potentialities of man. The concept of equality thus has opposite implications in the two visions. To those with the unconstrained vision, a greater equalization of material conditions is imperative, even if the means of accomplishing this require the more morally and intellectually advanced to restrict the discretion of others in the marketplace, or through judicial activism in the law, or by other social or political devices. The concepts of compassion, leadership, commitment, and rationality are featured prominently in the unconstrained vision. But to those with the constrained vision, the gap between the actual and the potential is much smaller, and with it there is a correspondingly smaller difference between the intellectual and moral elite on the one hand and the ordinary person on the other. Vast differences may exist between given areas of specialization, hence Burke's reverence for authorities within their respective specialties. But believers in this vision have long pointed out areas where ordinary people are greatly superior to intellectuals, so that there is no such general superiority as to justify one group's restricting the discretion of others and acting as a surrogate decision-makers for them. To those with the constrained vision, equality of discretion is more important than equality of condition. End quote. So equality of discretion, equality of power being more relevant and important than violating equality of power in order to facilitate equality of conditions. And then in regards to war, he says, quote, like other evils, war was seen by those with the constrained vision as originating in human nature and as being contained by institutions. To those with the unconstrained vision, war was seen as being at variance with human nature and caused by institutions. War was seen by Godwin as being a consequence of political institutions in general, and more specifically as a consequence of undemocratic institutions. War and conquest, according to Godwin, will never be undertaken but where the many are the instruments of the few. The localization of evil is one of the hallmarks of the unconstrained vision. There must clearly be some cause for evils. But insofar as these causes are not widely diffused as to be a part of human nature in general, then those in whom the evils are localized can be removed, opposed, or neutralized so as to produce a solution. The specifics of this localization, whether in undemocratic institutions in Godwin or in a capitalistic economy, as some modern writers, are less crucial than the localization itself, which makes a solution possible. Evils diffused throughout the human race can only be dealt with by trade-offs through artificial devices which themselves produce other unsatisfactory side effects. End quote. Yeah, kind of a recognition that war is an eternal factor in human nature. He goes on later on to talk about individual rights. He says, quote, "The constrained vision thinks of legal boundaries within which private individuals and groups may make their own decisions, without being second-guessed by the political or legal authorities as to whether those decisions are wise or foolish, noble or mean. From the standpoint of the constrained vision, the scope of those boundaries of immunity from public authority are the scope of people's rights. This is a process conception of rights, the legal ability of people to carry on certain processes without regard to the desirability of the particular results as judged by others. Although these rights, as zones of immunity from public authority, belong to individuals, their whole purpose is social in the constrained vision. In that vision, the sacrifice of the individual for the social good has a long tradition going back at least as far as Adam Smith in philosophy and economics, and Holmes and Blackstone in American and British law respectively. Yet it is precisely this tradition which has consistently emphasized the importance of individual property rights. For example, the crucial benefits of property rights have been conceived as social, as permitting an economic process with greater efficiency, a social process with less strife, and a political process with more diffused power and influence than that possible under centralized political control of the economy. The beneficiaries of such processes are conceived to be the population at large, and the justification or lack of justification of property rights is made to rest on that basis. In the same way, rights of free speech are zones of immunity from public authority, without regard to whether what is said is wise or foolish, noble or mean." End quote. Continuing to return to the diffusion of authority and the diffusion of knowledge and wisdom throughout the general population. And then later he says, quote, "Social processes are central to the constrained vision. Individual rights originate, take their meaning, and find their limits in the needs of social processes. However, that does not mean that incumbent judges or political leaders are authorized to expand or contract those rights in ad hoc fashion according to their changing assessments of social needs. On the contrary, these rights are domains of exemption from the judgments of political or legal authorities. The assessment of long-run social expediency is already implicit in that exemption. This is symptomatic of a more general difference between the constrained and the unconstrained visions. They differ not only in the locus of discretion and the mode of discretion, but also in the locus of assessment and the mode of assessment. In the constrained vision, man is capable of making long-run and general assessments of social processes, comparing constitutional government with alternative governments or competitive economics with politically directed economics, for example. The mode of assessment is experiential, and the revealed preference of the many, especially when they vote with their feet, is, from this perspective, more persuasive than the articulation of the few." End quote. So a little on property rights there. And then he closes with some comments about morals. He says, quote, both constrained and unconstrained visions are fundamentally and essentially visions of causation. Only derivatively do they involve clashes of moral principles, or differing hierarchies of social values. The much vaunted need to make our value premise explicit is irrelevant in this context. Thinkers with identical moral values and social preferences must nevertheless reach opposing conclusions if their initial senses of reality and causation, their visions, are different. Identical twins, bred to revere the same moral qualities in the same order, must differ in their conclusions if somewhere along the way one conceives of human attributes and social causation as described in the constrained vision, and the other conceives them as described in the unconstrained vision. Just as travelers, seeking the same destination, must head in opposite directions, if one believes it to be the east and the other believes it to be to the west, so those seeking the greater good for the greatest number, or any other similarly general moral precept, must favor opposite kinds of societies, if opposite kinds of human beings are assumed to inhabit those societies, leading to opposite kinds of social causation. Things must work first before they can work to any given end, and what will work depends on the nature of the entities involved and their causal connections. End quote. So yeah, it totally depends on how we see the world as to how we're going to be able to affect these moral decisions, even though people may have the same moral guides. Seeing things in multiple different ways of understanding how reality works in two different ways is going to result in two different solutions or two different processes or what have you. So I think that's a great book that continues to deal with these kind of two different ways of looking at the world, and I think that you can kind of fit that into the one that William James presented, where the unconstrained vision seems kind of along the lines of the tender-minded, and the constrained vision seems more along the lines of the tough-minded. I think that kind of fits together a little bit, which I think is interesting to see these different approaches to a social dichotomy. But I think this conflict of visions is pretty important because it comes down to whether or not you believe that there is a human nature and the value of it and whether it changes. I think that having a politics that recognizes the existence of a human nature, I don't want to say static, but a deep-rooted human nature is an important approach to politics. So I think this is where politics and naturalism begin to merge or lead toward similar conclusions. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. Check out my Facebook, my Patreon, leave me some feedback, and there will be more good stuff coming up on the way. Thanks for tuning in. This is Dylan John signing out.